Today's episode is brought to you by Hunt a Killer. The days are getting shorter and darker, and nothing seems more fitting than a horror story. That's why I'm excited to tell you about Hunt a Killer's new Blair Witch game. You'll be playing the main character in an immersive horror story. This is a new horror subscription tabletop game based in the Blair Witch universe. Each season is made up of 6 boxes or episodes, and each box is full of realistic evidence, maps, police reports, and more to provide a horrifying and immersive experience. Rather than a direct murder mystery this time around, Hunt a Killer has partnered with Lionsgate to tell a story that takes place in the Blair Witch cinematic universe. In this episode, Rosemary Kent, a woman who lives on the edge of the infamous Black Hills forest, needs your help to find her missing son. To reunite the Kent family, you must investigate the mysterious forest yourself. Will you face down the horror of the Blair Witch and those who serve her? It's the perfect activity to play while social distancing or having a small gathering or a date night where you get to work together instead of watching a screen. If you think that you can handle it, this Blair Witch game is designed so that you can even play it by yourself, making it the creepiest thing you can do when you're home alone. With this Blair Witch experience, you can have more fun at home for less than the price of a few drinks, a meal at a decent restaurant, or a movie. No babysitter required. Hunt a Killer's murder mystery game already has 100,000 active subscribers and over 2,000 5-star reviews, so you know they're good at telling stories, and this is maybe their best one yet. It's honestly the scariest tabletop game that I've ever played. I've played horror board games before, and this isn't like the rest. This game is actually very unsettling. It's sort of like spending the night in the woods alone type scary. Right now, you can go to huntakiller.com/letsread and use code LET'SREAD for 20% off your first box. Again, make sure to use the code LET'SREAD, that's LETSREAD, for a 20% discount. Can you survive the curse of the Blair Witch? I live in a fairly small city here in Arizona. About 40 miles or so to the north is the city of Phoenix, as well as the Tonto National Park. But to the south, it's pretty much all desert as far as the eye can see. A lot of outdoorsy type people opt to go hiking in the mountains of Tonto or along the Salt River near Roosevelt, but I much prefer the Sonora Desert. There's something really peaceful about being out there, and nothing beats rambling through the mesas, listening to Horse with No Name to relieve stress after a busy work week. But if there's one thing I've learned from hiking out there, it's to stick to the lowlands, because there are people hiding among the bluffs out there that you really don't want to run into. And this is the story of my own personal encounter with one of them that took place a few years ago. So I'm a couple of hours into my hike. It's unusually hot out for the late afternoon, and I'm starting to run out of water. I usually start heading back to my car when my canteen starts to run low, because, as you can imagine, it's not safe being out in the desert with no water. But I was in a real hiking mood. I had more than my usual amount of stress to burn off, and I honestly didn't really feel like turning around just yet. Then right as I'm deciding whether or not to actually call it a day, I see something shining out from a hilltop not too far away. It looked like a little blinking of light coming from my direct east, and it took me a moment to realize it was lens flare from a pair of binoculars. I figured it was another hiker, maybe even a group of them, and that if I asked nicely, I might be able to bum a little water off of them so I could continue my hike. So I pick up the pace, winding through the cacti in the hopes that I could catch them on the hilltop. It's tough going, and I'm sweating like a turkey during holiday season by the time I'm halfway up the hill, but I'm determined to reach the top before they depart, imagining that I might be able to make myself some new hiking buddies in the process. But when I finally reach the top, there's no one to be found. The place was completely deserted. I take a little look around, but still I don't see anyone. Yet I do find evidence that someone had in fact been there at some point, and recently too. I see all these gearboxes covered in some kind of camouflage material, canvas bags shoved into cracks into the boulders, solar panels sitting out in the sun, and even a kitchen with a stove set up under a rock overhang where there was a fire still burning. It was a full-on campsite on the top of that hill, with a pretty commanding view of the surrounding area. Only it was just a matter of minutes ago that I had seen the lens flare coming from what I assumed was this exact site. It was about then that I got this really eerie feeling that I was being watched from somewhere, and it didn't take long for me to discover how that feeling wasn't entirely without reason. "Manos arriba," someone said behind me in a gruff but chillingly calm voice. I know enough Spanish to be able to recognize that this meant hands up. Punctuating those words was the unmistakable sound of someone locking and loading a gun of some description. "Por favor, no dispares," I said as I raised my trembling hands into the air. "Please, don't shoot." The person then said something else in Spanish, something I didn't understand, but the fact that they then pushed me down onto my knees clued me into their meaning. I thought that this was it for me. You have no idea how easy it would have been for them to just shoot me there and then, before leaving my body out in the desert for the vultures and coyotes. Had they done so, there's a good chance no one would ever have found me, not in one piece anyway. But instead of just straight up executing me, this mysterious person began to pat me down for weapons. Then when they were happy I wasn't carrying any, they emptied my pockets of my wallet, phone, and car keys. "Policia?" they asked suddenly. Their words were muffled, and I could tell without turning around that something was covering their face. No policia, no estoy policia," I said insistently, realizing that my life depended on them believing my response to their question. There was every chance they might just put a bullet in the back of my head. Better to be safe than sorry, but no bullet came. Instead, I heard them talking in Spanish again, something that was too fast for me to understand. I thought it was another question or statement directed at me, until I heard someone's voice coming over a radio set, someone this person was obviously communicating with. I strained my ears to try to pick up on what they were saying, knowing that my safety probably depended on whatever reply they were giving, but again, I could barely make a word out. It was a dumb thing to do, but I think my curiosity just got the better of me for a moment, and I found myself turning slowly to try to get a look at the guy behind me. I only caught a little glimpse of the guy before he aimed his weapon at me and barked, "No me mires." Don't look at me, in my direction, but I vividly remember what he was wearing. Besides the ski mask that I had figured he was wearing, he basically had full military garb. Combat boots, khakis, a tactical vest that held spare magazines for his rifle, as well as what looked like little smoke grenades attached to it. I had no idea what he was doing up there, being so well equipped, but whatever it was, he meant business. The next thing I know, he throws my wallet, my water bottle, and my car keys down in front of me, then holds my driver's license up in front of my face. "You talk, you die," he said in English, before ordering me to my feet and dismissing me with a curt, "Vamos." I did as I was told. Utterly terrified, this mysterious gunman now knew my name and my home address, and would be able to share such information with whoever his superiors were. Naturally, I had absolutely no intention of reporting him to the police, and have actually never told a single soul this story until now, and I only do so under relative anonymity. Because when I got home from that hike, I actually did a little research on who that guy could have been, and what I found absolutely terrified me. One of the first things I read online was an NBC article from 2011 which detailed how the Sinaloa cartel was sending scouts up into the hills around the Sonora Desert in order to track the movement and activities of U.S. law enforcement. The article said these cartel surveillance teams will come up into the hills for sometimes 2 whole months at a time, and that there were thought to be 200 to 300 operatives working out there at any one time. They are even equipped with highly sophisticated military gear like night vision goggles and radio encryption equipment. I realized it was one of these guys that I had run into on my hike, and that I had been extremely lucky to have gotten to walk away without catching a bullet. If that guy had even suspected that I was a DEA agent or something and not some dumb hiker who was out walking somewhere he shouldn't have been, I'd have had my bones picked clean by desert scavengers before the weekend was out. I won't lie, I'm definitely no tough guy, and the whole experience most certainly put me off of hiking around the desert for a long time, as it was frankly one of the most terrifying experiences of my entire life. My first time back was a little nerve-wracking, and I couldn't quite keep my eyes off the hills, just looking for that telltale glare from the binoculars of someone watching me. These days, I'm back to making it out there at least once a week, but I make a point of staying away from the hilltops, because next time I run into one of those scouts from the Sinaloa cartel, I might not be so lucky. A few years ago, I took a break from my regular 9-to-5 job to go traveling around the world. It started with a nasty breakup with my girlfriend. I was fixated on it, like I literally couldn't get some of the things that she'd said out of my mind, and it got to the point where it was pretty severely affecting my performance at work. Luckily, my boss was pretty sympathetic towards the situation. He told me that I should take an extended holiday to basically flush my system, then return to work with the focus and drive I'd lost as a result of the breakup. That gave me the idea to go traveling. My travels started pretty simple at first. I rented a car and began to drive around Europe, seeing all the places that my ex had never fancied visiting when we were together. But it wasn't long before I developed a real thirst for adventure and began to crave visits to less conventional holiday destinations. That's how I ended up in the Sahara Desert. Egypt was an incredible country to visit. Seeing the Great Pyramids was truly a bucket list level experience, but time after time I felt like I was only seeing the exact same thing every tourist does when they're in that country. I wanted to get out somewhere off the beaten path to have a truly unique experience, so I found myself checking out brochures for desert tours. But like I said, almost every single one seemed like a complete tourist trap, where they take you out into the desert on a camel train, lead you around in a circle, then head back to civilization. I remember mentioning that exact thing to a guy in a tourist office, who in turn told me he had a friend that did business with a tribe of Bedouins who lived out in the Sahara. For a small fee, his friend would drive me out into the desert, where in exchange for a bit of cash I might be able to arrange a short stay among the tribesmen to experience an ancient way of living that would make for a truly unique experience. So a few days later I was sat in a 4x4, driving out into the Sahara with a complete stranger named Rashid. Rashid barely spoke any English, but we still found ways to communicate, and getting on the road for my first proper adventure made me feel like a discount Lawrence of Arabia or something. But the views of the desert were really something else. It was like an ocean of sand out there. The heat wasn't the only thing that fried my brain, just the sight of miles and miles of dunes as far as the eyes could see. It was absolutely incredible, and some of my best photos from the entire trip were taken from the tops of some of those mountains of rock and sand. Staying with the Bedouins was an amazing experience, too. I didn't think that they would be so welcoming to a complete stranger that wished to insert himself into their lives, but they didn't seem to mind at all. They called me Mosafir, which means traveler in Arabic, and invited me into their tents to drink coffee and sample their food. But the thing is, it's customary for Bedouin to offer their guests meat from the head of the sheep they slaughtered in their honor, particularly the eyeballs. Eating a sheep's eyeball was probably one of the scariest, most high-pressure things I'd ever had to do, as I was absolutely terrified of puking or retching in front of them, as there's no way that could be taken as anything other than an insult and the guest being ungrateful. But not only did I manage to keep it down, it didn't actually taste bad at all. It had an unusual texture, sure, but it wasn't unbearable by any stretch of the imagination. I thought the worst was over, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, Rashid, who'd stayed overnight with me so he could drive me back the following day, shook me awake in the guest tent. He was frantically talking in Arabic, and although I couldn't understand exactly what he was saying, I could tell from the tone of his voice that something was horribly wrong. But like I said, we didn't need much to be able to have a basic level of understanding, and when he picked up my rucksack and threw it towards me, I knew what he was getting at. We need to get out of here, and fast. At first, I thought there had been some kind of disagreement with the Bedouin. People were shouting outside of the tent, and in my half-awake daze, I thought it might have been out of anger. But as I came to my senses and walked outside the tent, I realized what it was in their voices. It was fear. In the distance, I saw something that at first I'm not sure my tiny Western brain could even compute. We don't have all that much in the way of extreme weather in England. The worst it gets is some heavy wind and rain. So seeing a huge wall of darkness on the horizon, a gargantuan mass of brown and black, was just about the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen in my life. It was a sandstorm, and it was approaching fast. Unlike the Bedouin, we were completely unprepared for a sandstorm of that magnitude. The damage it would do to our lungs if we were caught out in it, not to mention the damage it would do to Rashid's vehicle, might mean we would be stranded in the desert for a long, long time. The Bedouin only had barely enough supplies to support themselves, let alone 2 other strangers. We had to get out of there, and we had to do it quick. We barely got out in time, and looking back to see the Bedouin camp swallowed up by the sandstorm as it continued to pursue us across the desert was honestly terrifying. It was so impossibly huge. It reminded me of something out of a Lovecraft story or something that's so impossible to behold that it's kind of maddening, like it frazzles your brain just to lay eyes on it. We did end up making it back to civilization in time, where I held up in my hotel room until the storm passed. But the whole time, I couldn't keep my mind off of those poor Bedouin, stuck out there in the desert because they just didn't have the time to pack up and leave so they could dodge the storm. I ended up traveling all around Asia and America on my travels, and I have a few more scary stories from a handful of different places. But nothing really compares to laying eyes on that sandstorm for the first time. Sure, people can be scary enough, but I don't think they'll ever quite be able to match the kind of awesome terror that Mother Nature is capable of generating. On March 31st of 2016, 72-year-old grandmother Ann Rogers was driving across the desert to visit her grandchildren in Phoenix, Arizona. Ann lived over 100 miles away in the city of Tucson, so she didn't get to see her family nearly as much as she might like to, and since it was her grandkid's birthday, she was exceptionally excited to see them. But on the drive over, a series of unfortunate events would force the elderly grandmother into suffering through one of the most harrowing, life-threatening experiences of her entire life, one of terror, desperation, hardship, and ultimately survival. Around halfway into her journey across Arizona, Rogers found that her blue Ford Fusion was dangerously close to running out of gas. She stopped to ask directions from a friendly roadside pedestrian who pointed her in the direction of a nearby gas station. However, given that Rogers had informed the passerby that she was extremely low on gasoline, the directions she was given involved taking a shortcut down some back roads that would take her to the gas station without her completely exhausting her tank supply. This was Ann's first major mistake, since the back roads of Arizona desert looked pretty much identical, and as she tried to follow the directions, she became disoriented and took a wrong turn. As she continued to drive around the desert in the hopes of getting back on the right track, her hybrid began to stall as the engine exhausted the last of its gas, and eventually, the vehicle came to a complete stop and refused to start up again. But at first, Ann had no reason to panic. She'd had the good sense to pack plenty of food and water for the journey, including cans of fruit, chicken, nuts, and protein bars, as well as being accompanied by her 2-year-old rescue dog, a Queensland Terrier mix named Queenie, who, being the good girl that she was, provided plenty of moral support. Anne also had plenty of charge on her cell phone, so it was simply a case of calling a breakdown company to drive out to assist her, or so she thought. Because when she grabbed her phone to call someone, she discovered that the area she was in had absolutely no cell coverage at all. It was only then that the severity of her situation became clear. It would have been considerably easier to deal with if she had simply broken down on a major highway, but she was on a remote back road where no one but the kind direction-giving stranger knew to look for her. But being the wise old grandmother she was, Anne knew better to simply abandon her vehicle. Such modern vehicles were fitted with GPS microchips, so surely it would only be a matter of time before someone came looking for her. Besides, when she failed to arrive for her grandchild's birthday celebrations, someone would surely report her missing. And so as the sun began to dip towards the horizon and the desert night drew in, Anne decided to snuggle up under some blankets in the back seat of her vehicle with Queenie and get some much-needed rest. The next morning, Anne awoke and tried her cell phone again, finding that she still had no signal with which to summon aid. Even in March, when some areas of the country are experiencing brisk spring rains, the Arizona desert was almost unbearably hot and arid. But Anne still had a fair amount of water left, and expected people to be looking for her by now, so it seemed more likely that at some point during the day ahead, she would see rising dust in the distance as some kind of rescue vehicle came looking for her. But as the hours went by and no one appeared to assist her, Anne started to wonder if there was anyone even looking for her at all. But still, she knew not to stray from her vehicle, as it might only be a matter of hours before someone arrived to rescue her, and she definitely did not want to have wandered off when they arrived. But yet again, as the sun began to set on the Arizona desert, Anne realized that no one was going to find her that day, and that the chances of her being found were steadily decreasing. So once again, she cuddled up with Queenie under some blankets and began to make plans for the following day. Her water and food supplies were steadily running dry. If she didn't make efforts to replenish them, she would be dead within days. Rescue workers would come across her dehydrated corpse being picked clean by vultures, and vultures always go for the eyes first. The image haunted her as she lay there that second night, the thought of her own eyeless, sun-bleached face being the first thing her daughter would see upon having to identify her body. Actions had to be taken if she was to ensure her own survival. The very next morning, as soon as dawn broke, Anne stowed away her blankets, fetched a pair of binoculars from the trunk of her car, and headed up a nearby hill to scout the area. Through her binoculars, Anne observed the long desert road she had driven along, so long and winding that the main highway she had turned off in the first place was barely visible. She could attempt to retrace it and flag down help from a passing motorist, but she was no spring chicken, and with minimal water supplies it would be a huge risk to attempt to do so. Anne had also hoped that climbing such a steep hill to a higher altitude would give her the cell phone signal she needed to call in help, but to no avail, as she found she still had absolutely no reception. But then suddenly, she saw something glinting in the distance, something that would ultimately save her life. It was a freshwater creek, one that had to be a few miles away by her reckoning, but one that would provide the desperately needed water she needed to survive her ordeal. And so, without a moment's hesitation, wearing her fur-lined hiking boots, she and Queenie headed down the hillside and marched in the direction of the creek. Using an empty Nutella jar, the contents of which had sustained her rather effectively throughout the previous 2 days, Anne began to scoop up water which she shared between herself and Queenie. Some of the birthday gifts Anne had bought for her grandchildren included some art supplies, such as colored pens, stickers, and colored paper. When she purchased them just a few days prior, there was no way she could have known how such seemingly insignificant gifts would play such a crucial part in her attempts at survival. As she sat in the shade of a rocky outcrop near the creek bed, Anne used the art supplies she had purchased for her grandchildren's birthday gift to write a small note that simply said, "Am lost, trying to find people or ranch, hiking on downstream, barely any food for 3 days. Anne. However, Anne also realized that just leaving a note wasn't enough. Assuming she had been reported missing by concerned relatives by that point, the primary method that authorities would use in their attempt to locate her would be by helicopter. She had to be seen by air. She also remembered old movies where survivors would write SOS in the sandy beaches of the desert islands they were stranded on, or spell the letters out with palm fronds or fallen branches. But how, in a place where there is very little vegetation and where the dry, arid landscape would mean that any attempt to write something into the sand might be swiftly blown over by a gust of wind, would she make herself seen from the air? Yet it was about then that Anne spotted the bleached bones of a long dead elk lying in the sand, not so far away. And, in a communion of death and survival that seems positively poetic in retrospect, Anne used the old bones to spell out "help" in large, clumsy letters. The weight of the bones would mean that they would not be blown away or covered up, and the starched white of the bones meant that they would stand out like a sore thumb to someone viewing the area from a helicopter. Anne secured the handwritten note under one of the bones, ensuring that it would be found if someone got close enough to inspect the area. Now all she had to do was conserve as much energy as she could, be patient, and pray for rescue. Meanwhile, a horrendous series of misconstrued events meant that no one had actually reported Anne missing. You see, Anne decided to stay as quiet as possible about the visit so that it would be a surprise. Her children, simply assuming that she had forgotten about her grandchildren's birthday celebrations, were mad at her for having done so, and it was only on a day that Anne made the help sign out of elk bones that her daughter actually tried calling her cell phone to see what the problem was. Obviously, it didn't connect, so the daughter then tried calling one of Anne's friends who lived with her on the other side of Arizona. To the daughter's horror, Anne's friend assured her that her mother hadn't forgotten about the birthday celebrations at all, and had in fact departed for Phoenix 3 days prior, assuming that she hadn't returned because she was staying with the family for a few days. Anne's daughter flew into a panic, realizing her mother had gone missing, and immediately contacted the relevant authorities to report her disappearance. It had taken almost 3 whole days to summon any assistance for the missing woman. Almost 70 hours of valuable searching time had been wasted, all because of assumption and miscommunication. Time was running out for Anne Rogers, and fast. But finally, a team from Arizona Search and Rescue had been dispatched, who scoured the route between Anne's home and her route to Phoenix. But because they were totally unaware that she had driven off-road in the hopes of finding a shortcut to the gas station she was looking for, the search and rescue team looked for her in entirely the wrong place for the first 4 days of their search. So not a single trace of her or vehicle were found, culminating on the 5th day, when highly specialized sniffer dogs were called in to search for her. Only these dogs were not trained to search for living people. Quite the opposite. They were trained in sniffing out dead bodies. Arizona Search and Rescue had concluded that there was no possible way that a 72-year-old woman would be able to survive out in the desert for that long, and usually they might very well be correct to assume that. But on the very same day that the corpse-sniffing dogs had been called in, the search teams had made the decision to search the back roads around the highway that Anne was thought to have been traveling down. It was only then that they found her abandoned car, and the search teams went into overdrive in their attempts to locate her. They were close, very close, and they knew it. The helicopter that was previously involved in the operation was called back into service to scour the area surrounding Anne's abandoned vehicle for any sign of her, and it wasn't long before they noticed the help sign she had scrambled together using the elk bones. Ground teams moved in to search the area more intensively, and quickly found the handwritten note that Anne had left on that 3rd day when she walked to the creek to find water. But given that it had been written almost a week prior to its discovery, the ground teams feared the worst, knowing there was only a slim chance that Anne could have survived exposure and deprivation for that long. However, when they followed the creek downstream, they came across a dog splashing on the edge of water. It was Queenie, Anne's 2-year-old terrier mix, and close behind, haggard and weakened from more than a week living wild in the Arizona desert, was 72-year-old grandmother Anne Rogers. She had heard the steady thudding of the helicopter rotor blades, left an abandoned ranch that she had taken shelter in, and walked back along the creek in the hopes of running into those searching for her. It was a gamble. She was extremely weak by this point, but the gamble paid off. The rescue teams couldn't believe their eyes. Anne had no right to have survived such an ordeal, but there she was in the flesh. She had lost a dangerous amount of body weight due to starvation and dehydration, her skin flaked and peeling from the sunburn she had suffered, but the fact that she was standing at all was something of a miracle. But Anne was not as vulnerable as she may have first appeared. She grew up surrounded by nature, and was taught to forage, fish, and camp from a very early age by her outdoorsman father. She also learned how to discern edible plants from poisonous ones. These lessons saved her when wild plants were all she had to eat. She was also given the gift of a turtle that she sighted swimming in the creek one day. The turtle was moving slowly because the water was so cold, so she scooped it up with her foot, using her knife to kill it, and cooked it inside the shell, some of the only protein she was able to consume during her 9-day ordeal. Anne was immediately airlifted to the hospital nearby Payson as Arizona Search and Rescue informed her daughter that she had been found. Her daughter, Erin, immediately drove to the hospital to greet her, elated with the news that she had survived such a harrowing ordeal. It was a tearful reunion between a mother and daughter who had believed that they might never see each other again. Anne's daughter sobbed her apologies that she hadn't called in help earlier, and promised never to take her mother for granted ever again. Anne forgave her in an instant, confessing that it was foolish of her to allow herself to run so low on gas in the first place, and that she'd never have forgotten her grandkids' birthdays in a million years. After a few days in the hospital and IV drip, Anne Rogers was discharged, only to be greeted by a flurry of local media outlets who had been following the story of her disappearance closely. As crazy as it sounds, I'd like to get back out there as soon as possible, she said to the shock of the gathered press. I could definitely paint for the next 20 years all the incredible, beautiful canyons, trees, rivers, and rocks that I saw. It's like being in Sedona, only multi-layered, over and over again. Those incredibly wonderful geological scenes all around me. It's frankly incredible that someone could go through such a traumatic and terrifying experience, and then come out the other side of it with such clarity and conscience. Anne Rogers faced a lonely, agonizing death out there in the desert of Arizona, an experience that would have scared most people out of their wits. Yet she survived, and maybe we can draw on Anne as an inspiration for our own lives, and learn from her that no matter how terrible a situation seems, keeping a cool head and remembering our loved ones can get us through just about anything. On Friday, May 31st, 2019, Juan Gonzalez, a resident of Las Vegas, Nevada, drove over to his sister's house on West Pebble Road near Durango. He and 24-year-old Esmeralda had always been close. Having been born in Michoacan, Mexico, their family had emigrated north not long after Esmeralda was born. They grew up as strangers in a new land, one in which they often felt like outsiders. As a result, Juan had always been particularly protective of his little sister. But when called over and rang the doorbell, there was no reply. This was unusual, as Juan had called ahead a few days before to make sure that she would be home at the time of his visit, and given that he hadn't received any calls or texts from her that day, he had no reason to suspect that she wouldn't be home. After several more rings of her doorbell, she still didn't answer, so Juan walked around the property to peer through a window just in case her sister was listening to music using earbuds, which she often did during her regular workouts. What he saw inside frightened the life out of him. The home had been completely ransacked, with furniture flipped over and pieces of broken ornaments strewn around the rooms. Juan forced his way into his sister's home, calling out to her as he did so, but still there was no reply. The place was completely deserted. Juan immediately called the police to report his sister missing. Police records indicate that he was obviously extremely worried about his sister's well-being, and he had good reason to be, too. Ever since she graduated with a communications degree from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Esmeralda had dreamed of a career in media. In a Facebook post from 2017, she gushed over the fact that she had finally been able to meet some of the news anchors from TV's Telemundo, who held positions that she deeply coveted due to her Latin background. But competition for such media jobs is extremely fierce, particularly for niche organizations such as Spanish-language news outlets. Esmeralda strove to make a name for herself, cultivating an Instagram following of over 300,000 by posting glamour shots that she acquired as part of her side hustle of modeling and exotic dancing. The profile described her as a real estate investor, humanitarian, social scientist, anthropologist, and foreign model. She was a very sweet, very nice young woman, neighbor Janice Zeno told a local news outlet in the days following her disappearance. She had a cute little toy poodle, and she would sit out on the little bench outside of her house, and she was very pleasant every time we spoke to her. Esmeralda also had big dreams, and once posting a Facebook status that simply read, "Life without dreaming is a life without meaning." But time and time again, her hopes of securing a media career were dashed, until one day, Esmeralda seemed to suffer from a full-on nervous breakdown. After a brief stay in a psychiatric unit in her adopted hometown of Las Vegas, doctors diagnosed her with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. But despite being prescribed a series of antipsychotic medications in the wake of her breakdown, Esmeralda's condition appeared to have worsened. She became more and more heavily involved in the adult entertainment industry, and along the way found that narcotics were much more effective at alleviating her stress and disappointment than any of the doctor-prescribed medications, with her drug of choice apparently being crystal methamphetamine. Obviously, such heavy use of the drug had a devastating effect on her mental health, as well as her finances, with Esmeralda being forced into performing seedier and sleazier acts in order to fund her lifestyle. Her brother Juan and the rest of her family were all too aware of her recent struggles, which is what led Juan to seek to check up on her the day that she was found to be missing. In order to aid the ongoing police investigation into her whereabouts, the Gonzalez family set up a Facebook page, simply titled Find Esmeralda Gonzalez. A post on the page from June of 2019 states that it has been an absolute nightmare not knowing where she is. We're just worried about her every day, constantly thinking about her, and appealed to anyone who might have any information on her whereabouts to come forward. Yet 3 months later, in September, Esmeralda had still not yet been found, and none of those involved were any closer to determining just where she was located. One post on the Facebook page noted that Esmeralda had been missing for 99 days. Our page was temporarily down to attempt to give Esmeralda's family a break from the emotional toll of this experience. Thank you everyone for your positive wishes and continued concern. Days later, some deeply concerning details emerged regarding her well-being before she went missing. Gonzalez was described by the Facebook page devoted to finding her as being in fragile mental health in the days leading up to her murder. In the days before her disappearance, Esmeralda experienced multiple psychological episodes. She's extremely vulnerable. We miss the friendly and cheerful presence of Esmeralda. Her family desperately seeks answers about her whereabouts, a post read. Las Vegas Metro Police then made a disturbing breakthrough. They discovered that Esmeralda had been sighted the day before she disappeared at a nearby car dealership and later on the home surveillance camera of one of her neighbors. She was dressed only in lingerie and high heels and was reportedly acting dispirited and depressed. The events that led up to her walking around in next to nothing in a melancholy daze are unknown, but it doesn't take a detective to work out that they can't have been good. After watching a series of tapes from CCTV cameras near the dealership, police contacted identifiable witnesses who reported that Esmeralda had apparently stopped them to ask for a ride. Another pair of homeowners told police that she had actually tried to open up the door of her home in an upset and disoriented state before they were forced to make it clear that their home was most certainly not the one she was looking for. This was the last time she was seen alive. However, Vegas Metro Police knew that they were extremely close to finding her, and once again appealed to the general public after disclosing the breakthroughs of the case. It was then they received a horrifying tip from an anonymous caller who claimed to have been visiting a friend's house during the last week of May, where they'd seen a beautiful young Latina girl wearing nothing but lingerie. After the girl and their friend had gotten into some kind of verbal altercation, the girl had apparently punched the caller's friend in the face and threatened to call the police. She was then dragged into a bedroom where the altercation apparently continued. After some time, the anonymous caller walked over to the bedroom door, opened it, and peered inside. There they discovered a nightmarish scene that they told police was something out of a horror movie. The caller's friend had the young woman tied to a bedpost, apparently have beaten her until she was barely recognizable as a human being. The caller then noticed that next to her tied-up body was a bottle of swimming pool cleaner with the cap off. Their friend has filled with a syringe with the caustic liquid and was in the process of injecting it into the semi-naked girl's veins. The caller then fled the residence in horror and had not spoken to their friend since, but did note that they had observed erratic behavior from them in the days that followed. The homeowner was a 45-year-old man by the name of Christopher Prestopino, who lived on the exact same street as Esmeralda Gonzalez. Vegas Metro Police then paid a visit to Prestopino's residence to question him on the girl's whereabouts. As soon as he denied the events having happened or that any such female had ever visited his home, they knew they were onto something. Police then went about investigating Prestopino's actions in the days that followed the apparent incident, discovering that he had rented a 15-foot truck from the U-Haul moving and storage outlet on the 8600 block of South Las Vegas Boulevard. He had apparently picked the truck up at around 6:30 p.m. on June the 8th, returning it 2 days later. Employees remembered that the truck smelled heavily of cleaning products, which was highly unusual given the dire state of some of the vehicles returned to them. The vehicle was then tracked from the U-Haul outlet to a nearby Home Depot, where the store's CCTV cameras captured Prestopino purchasing what appeared to be 2 boxes of deck screws, an Ocean Mist filter fresh clip strip, 2 tubes of WD-40 silicone lube, then 96-inch 2x4 studs, 5 60-pound bags of concrete mix, 1 50-pound bag of lime, 8 concrete fence cap blocks, and an iced coffee. Homicide detectives were then able to track the U-Haul truck on its journey back to Prestopino's home, where it stayed until the next day, where Prestopino appeared to drive it out into the desert north of Las Vegas. Detectives then enlisted the help of a local search unit, giving them a rough area of a few square miles to comb over and instructed to report back with anything unusual that they might notice, especially any signs of construction involving concrete. With the aid of a helicopter observation unit, Las Vegas Metro Police drove out into the desert and began an intensive search of the area they'd been given. Ground teams scoured the area, searching gullies and ravines, covering every inch of the dry, dusty desert in the hopes of finding a clue to Esmeralda's whereabouts. Homicide detectives had initially speculated that Prestopino may have driven a still-living Esmeralda into the desert to imprison her in some kind of makeshift concrete cell. But the reality was much more horrifying, because on October the 8th, a full 4 months after Prestopino had rented the U-Haul truck from the outlet on South Vegas Boulevard, the search teams came across a homemade wood and concrete structure hidden in a compact desert valley. They broke open the wooden exterior to find that inside was not a hollow containment area, but solid concrete. There were no obvious signs of foul play, but the structure was still extremely suspect, especially given that it was made up of the exact purchases that Prestopino had made during his 8th of June visit to Home Depot. A team was called in to break up the concrete block, and as they did so, the smell of death filled the air around them. Contained in the solid concrete that stood before them was the dead body of Esmeralda Gonzalez. Vegas Metro Police immediately issued an arrest warrant for Christopher Prestopino. He was found at his home, putting up no resistance as he was arrested on charges of open murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to murder. Police then drove him over to the Clark County Detention Center, where he was interred on a bond of $500,000. Prestopino's 31-year-old girlfriend Lisa Mort also faced a charge of harboring, concealing, or aiding a felon, given that she was noted to have visited her boyfriend at home during some of the events in question. Clark County online court records show that Prestopino is a felon. He has multiple drug cases on his criminal history, including one of manufacturing meth. His felony case for drug dealing dates to 2001 and resulted in a suspended sentence and probation. His trial for Esmeralda Gonzalez's murder was set to begin in late April of this year, but there has been little media coverage, and we will simply have to wait to see what the verdict will be. But God help any jury that has to survey the evidence surrounding the case and contemplate the sad and terrifying events that led a young woman with big dreams to be murdered in such a horrific fashion before being encased in concrete, driven out into the desert, and left there in the hopes that she would never be found. We can only imagine how horrifying Esmeralda's final moments were. Seeing a man who lived on the very same street as her, someone she probably knew personally, about to inject pool cleaner into her veins, a traumatic end to the life of a troubled young woman. May she see justice, and may she rest in peace. I live out here in Las Cruces, New Mexico, right on the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert. About once a month, me and a few buddies of mine drive out to the Chihuahuan Desert Nature Park to drink Coronas and grill up some meat on a campfire. All but one of us are married with kids now, having put our wilder days behind us, so getting out to the nature park every so often is pretty much the only time we get to hang out and escape the mundane aspects of family life. Don't get me wrong, I love my wife and kids, and I'm pretty happy in my career, but nothing beats hooking up with the boys for a few hours of beer and big boy talk. So, this one time, we're out there sinking brews and complaining about the Cardinals with hot dogs and jerky when I find myself needing to sneak off to take a whiz. I find myself a collection of little shrubs to serve as an impromptu urinal, then unsheath my pork sword and begin to relieve myself. I should note at this point that I'm wearing khaki shorts and boots, so you can picture how this goes down. Right as I finish up and I'm zipping my fly back up, I feel something tickling the hairs of my left leg. I look down, and there's a freaking scorpion crawling up my leg. Now you should know I am absolutely terrified of spiders and scorpions, like I'd actually pee my pants scared. Anyone else might have just slapped the thing off of their leg like a ninja, but I just freeze up completely, watching as the thing continues to crawl up my leg using my hairs to get higher and higher, until it's in a serious danger of sneaking up the leg of my shorts. I had like one last chance to get that thing off of me before it disappeared, and unfortunately for me, I simply could not summon the bravery to do so. So, I was forced to watch as that evil little monster crawled up in my shorts. And this next part is why I no longer wear boxer shorts, and made a heavy investment into a bunch of snug-fitting trunks in the aftermath of this nightmarish event. Because the scorpion doesn't stop when it's hidden away under my shorts, and I can feel it slowly but surely crawling up my thigh, further and further, until it reaches the loose opening of my underwear. Now at this point, my buddies are calling out to me and making all kinds of dumb jokes about me playing with myself over a particularly attractive wild pig. I wanted to tell them what was going on. Maybe they'd have been able to find a way to rescue me from a fate worse than death, but like I said, I was just froze in absolute terror as I feel that scorpion crawling into my underwear and dangerously close to my junk. By the time my buddy Jay walks over to actually see if I'm okay, I can actually feel the scorpion crawling over my member and trying not to wince as I feel its sharp little legs digging into the sensitive flesh down there. It takes absolutely all of my strength to just turn my head and face them, and immediately they know something is horribly wrong. I'm sweating, I'm pale, my hands are shaking, and I can barely talk. But I do manage to get out the words, "Scorpion, it's on my junk." Jay's all like, "What did you say, dude? There's a scorpion on your junk, like for real?" All I can do is reply in a nod. Jay runs back to the guys to tell them what's going on. Having known from the look on my face that I was most definitely not kidding around, and immediately they all rushed over, which is when I noticed that Jay has this big gnarly stick in his hand that he starts holding like a Louisville Slugger as he gets closer. So I'm just stood there, trying to stay stone still as the boys argue amongst themselves about why it would or wouldn't be a good idea to smash me in the junk with a stick in the hopes of killing the scorpion and saving me from perhaps the worst pain that any man could ever experience. And all the while, I have to just stand there and feel every little movement of that scorpion as it navigates its way across my meat and taters, praying that it doesn't opt to just nestle up inside my underwear as its new, fleshy home. The whole time I'm just thinking like, please keep going, please keep going, please keep going, just willing this little creature to keep moving through my boxers and out the other side, which thankfully it does. I've never been so convinced of the existence of an ever-loving God than I was in that moment, as I felt the scorpion crawl out the other side of my boxers and down my right thigh. Then, as it slowly emerged from the right side of my shorts, one of my buddies leans in and smacks the thing off my leg with one swift, liberating flash of movement. I let out a full 5 minutes of terror and anxiety in the moments that followed, marching back up towards the fire in the cooler, screaming out every single expletive I had stowed away in my memory bank before downing like 2 full Coronas and cursing the fact that we didn't have the foresight to have packed anything stronger. Luckily, it didn't take long for us all to see the funny side, with my buddies making jokes about how a scorpion had gotten closer to my junk than my wife had in years. I have to admit, I laughed at that one, and the jokes helped break the tension and calm me down. But seriously, that was legit one of the scariest experiences of my entire life. I can't even imagine the kind of pain I'd been in if I'd had panicked and had that little monster sting my twig or berries. And now, when we go out to the nature park for brews and boy talk, I always wear long pants. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember,